And so David's life, it was a soap opera. And I know none of you watch soap operas, and so that's hard for you to understand. But David's life was full of drama, yet Solomon's life was like a movie that had an ending that you didn't see coming. Shayna hates watching movies with me because, I don't know about you, movies are really predictable. And then you get halfway through and you figured out the plot and you say, they're going to break up, and then something's going to happen, and they're going to get back together at the end. Happy ending. Woo! It's so predictable sometimes. And so I love the movie that you're watching, and all of a sudden something happens at the end, and you go, wow, I did not see that coming. That's how Solomon's life was. It plays out a certain way, and halfway through you say, I've got this thing all figured out. And then suddenly, the end comes, and you go, man, I didn't see that coming. So all throughout Solomon's life, he's given the opportunity to glorify God, and he takes every opportunity to do just that. His life is filled with glorifying his God and pointing people to him. But then something happens at the end of Solomon's life, and you go, wow, I didn't see that coming. I wasn't expecting that. You see, like Benjamin Button, Solomon's life is a picture of a man who grew backwards. It grew in the wrong direction. It went backwards and downwards. He was a bright morning ending in a stormy night. As we look at Solomon's life, we ask the question and then we answer. We say, what are these dead leaves laying on the ground at Solomon's feet? And we say those leaves are the perished buds and the blossoms of a holy character. You see, when all is said and done, Solomon is a man who suffered and dies from spiritual atrophy. So let's start at the beginning. Solomon becomes king. He becomes king, he's reigning, and in the beginning, God asks him, or tells him rather, you can have whatever you want. And he begins his reign in wisdom. But before he even begins to become king, his throne is taken. Remember, David's life was full of drama, and David is still alive at this point. And so one of David's sons says, my dad's old. He can't rule this kingdom. I'm going to just take his place. And so he creates all of these circumstances. He has a parade. He has a priest. He has everything that is needed except for David's blessing. He has everything that's needed to become king. And so suddenly Nathan comes to Bathsheba and she says, whoa. Or he says, did you hear that Adonijah has become king? You know, didn't David tell you that Solomon would become king? This isn't good for you guys. So here's what you need to do. And so Nathan the prophet tells Bathsheba that she needs to go to David and basically say, didn't you promise me that my son, Solomon, would be king? And so, and then Nathan tells her, you know, you'll be talking to him, and then I will come in, interrupt, and I will tell him the news about his son Adonijah becoming king. And so they execute this plan, and it works perfectly. And so by the end of that discussion, David puts things into motion to where Solomon will become king. And so once David dies, Solomon is king over all of Israel. And so while he's at Gibeon one day, there he is sacrificing, the Lord appears to him in a dream. And God says, listen, Solomon, I'm going to give you whatever you want. You just ask for it, and it's yours, man. It's yours. Now, Solomon is given something better than a genie in the bottle with 3 wishes. He is given a guarantee from the creator of the entire universe that whatever you want, you're going to get it. Ask yourselves, if God told me I could have anything, what would I ask for? I took the liberty to answer this for some of you. I think some of you would probably ask for a tractor or a lawnmower that would fix itself for free. It would just keep running, and if it stopped running, it would just fix itself. The part would be there. I think some of you maybe would ask for a self-weeding garden. Some of you might even ask for a water spigot. If you could have anything, you might just ask for a water spigot right by your garden so that you don't have to stretch 100 foot of hose from here to there. Some of you might ask for world peace. Some of you would ask for cake. That's okay. Solomon doesn't ask for any of those things. In fact, we look at Solomon's response and we think, lame. Come on, man, you had the opportunity to ask for whatever you wanted. And Solomon says, give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. Solomon has the opportunity to ask for anything. What does he ask for? He asks for wisdom. He asks for wisdom. And the Lord is so pleased with Solomon's request that he not only grants him wisdom, but he also gives him wealth and honor. Now, what sounds like the beginning of a bad, tasteless joke is Solomon's first test. Here's what happens. 2 prostitutes walk into a courtroom. All right? And the one says, this lady who's living with me had a baby shortly after I had a baby. And in the middle of the night, this lady's baby, she rolled over on it, and it was no more. But then she took my baby and convinced me that my baby was the one who died. The other woman, that's not true at all. That was my baby. I didn't know I could go that high. And so this goes back and forth. This mine, no, it's mine. And so finally Solomon, all right, give me the baby and bring me a sharp sword. We're going to cut this baby in half so each of you can have part of it. And the real mother says, no, don't do it. Give it to her. But then the fake mother says, well, I don't care. If I don't get it, you're not going to get it. And so from that, Solomon says, I know whose baby it is. It's the woman who's concerned about it. And so we read that God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore, that he spoke 3,000 proverbs and his songs numbered 1,005. And so whenever you read your Bible, you look at the book of Proverbs and the book of Ecclesiastes and that scandalous book of the Song of Solomon or the Song of Songs. Those 3 books are attributed to Solomon. Now, Solomon didn't only begin with wisdom, but he had an ambition to build. You see, Solomon lived in a time period where the kingdom was at peace, it was together, and so Solomon's desire was to form alliances and to build. You see, there was no recession in Jerusalem because Solomon had people building left and right. The construction boom was like none other. Solomon had people build a palace for his brand new wife, the Pharaoh's daughter. Solomon has a palace built for himself. He has a meeting room built for the dignitaries whenever they come to visit. He has everything. But perhaps the thing that he is most remembered for is building the temple. Building a temple. Solomon's temple was the first building that was built to house the Ark of the Covenant outside of the tabernacle, which was a mobile tent that was built and taken down. And this temple, to build this thing, it was a dream of David's. But God said, listen, David, you've committed way too much murder, way too much bloodshed in your time. So here's the deal, buddy. you're not the one to build the temple, but your son Solomon is. And so David, even though he had the desire to build, he couldn't, but he got everything in place. He brought in some the gold and different other building supplies, so he kind of had them on standby. And so Solomon started working on the temple in the 4th year of his reign, and it took him 7 years to build. It was a magnificent structure, yet it was humble and modest. The temple measured 90 feet by 30 feet. I've been told on good authority that the church is 60 by 40. And so the temple was just another 30 feet longer than our church building. So it wasn't just this huge, magnificent structure. It was modest. In the front, right there at the porch, there were these 2 huge bronze pillars. And so then you walked in and you entered into the holy place. This was built with cedar and pine and juniper and olive wood. In this room here is where the priests conducted their daily business, their daily ministry. And then at the far end of the holy place, over here, separated by a curtain and even a wall, and there was this little door to walk through, there was the most holy, the Holy of Holies. And so if you can imagine, you guys would be in the holy place. And there would be a curtain and a wall separating the two. And then up here, kind of on a raised platform, was the Ark of the Covenant. And next to the Ark of the Covenant, on each side, there were these cherubims built out of wood with their wings extending to the walls. And by the way, this most holy place was covered in gold. And so you walk in, and not only is the glory of God there with the Ark of the Covenant, but there is gold everywhere. It was a magnificent room. And in addition to the 2 main rooms, there were rooms on the sides, and then there was also an upper room, upper area. And this place, whenever it was being built, it took 80,000 stone cutters to cut the stone. And what they did was they went to the rock quarry and they cut the stones there. And so at the temple, at the actual temple building area, there wasn't a sound of a hammer or a chisel heard. It was just the reverence of God whenever they were constructing the temple. Now, in addition to the building of the temple, Solomon ordered that the building of various instruments to be used. That's this stuff out here. On the inside, on the outside. If I could have my volunteers come up. Craig and Don. Come on up. Come on up, Craig and Don. You're on the hold this extension measurement stick. It's actually called a tape measure. So what I want you guys to do is extend it out 15 feet. Don, you're in charge. So out in the courtyard, there stood this giant laver. It was a giant bath, and it was 15 feet across, and it was full of water, and it set on top of 12 bronze bowls. It was known as the sea. It was used for ceremonial washing of the priests. Now I'd like you guys to stretch out to 30 feet. That's a 30-foot tape measure, so I don't know if it's ever been stretched that far before. And so also out in the courtyard set a 30 by 30 altar. It was 30 foot long and 30 foot wide, and it set 15 foot high. So Craig, get on top of Don's shoulders. No, not really. So can you imagine that out in this courtyard there is an altar, a giant barbecue grill, okay, that's stretched 30 foot by 30 foot and it's at 15 foot high. That's this area right here. This is where the sacrifices were put. And then also there were 10 movable carts. Here are 5. There were 5 on the other side. 10 movable carts that were used to wash the burnt offerings. They each held 230 gallons of water. The baptistry probably holds between 100 and 150 gallons of water. And so just everything that was going on is done on a large scale. Thank you, guys. You can set that down. If it doesn't, it might not even wind up anymore. Excellent. And in addition to the things on the outside, on the inside, there was the golden altar of incense. There were 10 golden tables for the bread of the presence, and there were also 10 golden lampstands. Now, whenever Solomon dedicated the temple, he did so with a great prayer and a huge, enormous offering. Wilbur Fields writes that the dedication of Solomon's temple was perhaps Solomon's finest hour. With Solomon's prayer, he showed a genuine recognition of God. He says, "O Lord, God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth below. You who keep your covenant of love with your servants, who continue wholeheartedly in your way." He also prayed, "Praise be to the Lord who has given rest to his people, Israel, just as he promised. Not one word has failed of all the good promises he gave through his servant Moses." In addition to recognizing God, he also recognized how inadequate the temple was to house God. He says and prays, "But will God really dwell on earth? The heavens, even to the highest heaven, cannot contain you. How much less this temple I have built?" Yet despite all of this, Solomon had a desire for the temple to be used by God to point all nations to the one true God. Solomon prayed, "Then hear from heaven your dwelling place, and do whatever the foreigner asks of you, so that all the peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your own people Israel. And may they know that this house I have built bears your name." Now, in addition to this prayer, Solomon sacrificed 22,000 cattle and 120,000 sheep. Now, that 30 by 30 altar, it wasn't big enough to house or to put all of those animals on top. And so this was a day-long process. And this dedication happened during the Feast of Tabernacles, which was a week-long festival where the Israelites came and they remembered the time they spent wandering in the desert, sleeping in tents. And during this time, there was a tremendous amount of sacrifices made. So it's a possibility that the 22,000 cattle and the 120,000 sheep was for that entire week-long festival. But nevertheless, it's a big barbecue because it didn't necessarily go to waste. It was eaten. And so what is God's reaction to this temple and the dedication? Well, whenever the priests brought the ark into the most holy place, a cloud filled the entire room, and then it went out into the rest of the temple. We read that the cloud filled the temple of the Lord, and the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled his temple. Now, in addition to filling the entire temple with his presence, he sent down fire from heaven that consumed, or rather that burnt up the offerings. We read that when Solomon finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices. And so people are standing there, and all of a sudden, I mean, what a show of God's power. What a show of his presence. Not only did he fill the temple with his presence signified in a cloud, but he also rained down fire, and it went onto the altar. Now, in response to these two events, all of the people knelt on the pavement with their faces to the ground, and they worshipped and gave thanks to the Lord, saying, "He is good, his love endures forever." Now, in Solomon's life, God appeared to him in a dream and granted him the opportunity to begin his reign with wisdom. While ruling with great wisdom, Solomon desired to build great things, and one of those things that he desired to build was a temple for God. Solomon was on the fast track of success in God's eyes because he was doing everything that pleased him. Now, though God had received the temple with acceptance or with gratitude, he accepted it on a condition. And the conditions were, walk before me and I'll fulfill my promise to your father. And God says, I will never fail to give you a man from your descendants to rule over Israel. But God says, if you turn away and forsake the decrees and commands I have given you and go off to serve other gods and worship them, then I will uproot Israel from my land, which I have given them. And I will reject this temple I have consecrated for my name. I will make it a byword and an object of ridicule among all peoples. And so, how does this story end for Solomon? Well, if you don't know by now, it doesn't end well. It doesn't end well at all. For the man who was known for his wisdom, it doesn't really appear that he exercised a lot of wisdom in the end of his life. And truthfully, there wasn't one single thing that caused Solomon to fall. Not one single thing. Because it was 700 things. He had 700 problems. We read that Solomon had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God as the heart of David his father had been. Now, just 700 wives isn't a very wise thing. I mean, I don't know about you men. One wife is hard enough. But 700 wives, it's been said that age reveals character. And it is further implied that age seems to take away the power of acting a character, even of those who have done a lifelong masterful work of hiding their true character. The real man will appear, at first fitfully and then predominantly. Time, it is said, spares the chiseled beauty of stone and marble, but makes a sad havoc in plaster and stucco. You see, despite Solomon's life being given to God and being lived for God, he lost touch of reality and exchanged the truth of God for a lie. He worshipped the created things rather than the Creator. And so as a result of Solomon moving away from God, God moved away from Solomon. Since Solomon committed spiritual adultery, God left him. We read that although God had forbidden Solomon, so the Lord said to Solomon, since this is your attitude, and you've not kept my covenant and my decrees which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe, for the sake of David my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. You see, though much of Solomon's life had been devoted to God, by the end of his life he suffered from a great sickness. He suffered from spiritual atrophy. Now, spiritual atrophy is whenever your spiritual life decays and eventually disappears. To suffer from spiritual atrophy, it's a slow fade away from God. It's not all of a sudden, hey, I got it. No, it's a slow fade, and it involves years of neglect and compromise. And this is a disease that every Christian has to be on their guard against. It doesn't simply affect kings. And so here are two ways to avoid spiritual atrophy. Number one, and it's your first fill in the blank, train yourself to be godly. Train yourself to be godly. Paul writes to Timothy, and he says, train yourself to be godly. For physical training is of some value, but godliness has value for all things, holding promise for both the present life and the life to come. You see, there's a difference between trying to follow Jesus and training to follow Jesus. Think about this. What would be easier? Trying to run a marathon or training to run a marathon? And I know exactly what you're thinking. It doesn't matter if I try or train, I'm not going to run a stinking marathon. It's going to be a whole lot easier for you if you decide a year in advance that you're going to walk a marathon, that you train yourself to get up to that, instead of just waking up one morning and saying, hey, Bowling Green's having their run for your life race, so I'm going to go do that. You think about it like this. There are certain people, and I know some of you probably are familiar with them. There are people who live in the city, who have lots of money, who say, I want to be a farmer. And so they take a lot of their money and they buy some land out here in the country and they buy equipment and all of that stuff and they say, hey, look at that. I'm a farmer. I'm trying to be a farmer. It works. But those of you who have been farming your entire lives know that just buying stuff and actually learning to use it and learning to farm is completely different. And so trying to follow Jesus versus training to follow Jesus is different also. And we use our spiritual disciplines. Spiritual disciplines are the way that we learn to follow Jesus. They help us to grow. Paul said, everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. And so the strict training that Christians go into, it involves practicing spiritual disciplines. Spiritual disciplines are things like prayer and confession, regularly praying and regularly confessing. That's an aspect of a spiritual discipline. Studying and reading the Bible, meditating on the Word of God. Whenever you're faced with an issue of stress or temptation, rather than going, ah! Or maybe in addition to doing that, you take your mind and you set it on things of the Bible and you figure out, okay, this is the proper course of action. Another spiritual discipline involves fasting. Just giving up something, whether it be the internet or food. You give it up for God for time. Also, serving others and giving are different spiritual disciplines. All of those things help us to grow in our faith. There's something that cave-dwelling creatures teach us. Other than that they're creepy and you don't want them to land on you, they teach us if you don't use it, you... Oh, let's try that again. Cave-dwelling creatures teach us one thing. They teach us that if you don't use it, you lose it. That's right. And so what happens to the person who stops being informed with what's going on in the world? Well, they should lose the right to have an opinion. But it doesn't work that way. So let's try something different. What happens whenever you stop using your muscles? If you just decide to just sit and do nothing, your muscles, they what? You lose them. Yeah. And so what happens if you stop training to follow Jesus? Well, then you stand the opportunity, you run the risk of losing the opportunity of following Jesus. Because if you're not following Jesus, you're following something else, which leads to the second way to avoid spiritual atrophy, and that is to watch. Watch what you believe, because your life will imitate your beliefs. Paul again writes to Timothy, watch your life and doctrine closely. Persevere in them, because if you do, you will save both yourself and your hearers. You see, we have to be careful about the compromises that we make. There are certain compromises in life that are good. Like, say, if you're continually running late, a good compromise is to call those who are involved and say, hey, I'm running late. A bad compromise is whenever you give up a certain practice of your Christian faith in order to please the world around you. You see, if we're not careful of the compromises that we make, pretty soon we've made so many compromises that we're completely different. And in addition to being careful on the compromises, we have to be careful about what we believe. In the world today, there is a lot of junk gospel teaching going on. And by junk gospel teaching, I mean it's a false doctrine. It's not even the true gospel of Jesus Christ. It just looks like it. And if we're not careful, all of a sudden we're going to start following that junk gospel. And then what happens is we're leading a train of individuals to hell. That's why Paul says, watch your life and doctrine closely. Persevere in them, because if you do, you will save yourself and your hearers. And there's good news, because spiritual atrophy can be prevented, and it can even be reversed. You see, to prevent spiritual atrophy, you have to be proactive. You have to be proactive. You do things. You train yourself to be godly. You watch your life and your doctrine closely. You are proactive in avoiding spiritual atrophy. But also, to reverse spiritual atrophy, you must be reactive. You have to be reactive. You have to recognize that you're moving towards a problem. Your spiritual health has to be more important to you than your physical health. And I say that because I'm a man. And sometimes, as men, let's say my ear is hurting. Well, I'm not going to go to the hospital until I've got blood coming out of my ear. What we do is we treat our physical health as if it's not that big of a deal. We have habits or we do certain things, and we keep doing those things until the doctor says you have to change, or else it's going to be a very short life for you. We have to watch out for our spiritual health. Paul says, examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves. Test yourselves. To understand where you're doing, how you're doing spiritually. Whenever for physically, we compare ourselves to a physical specimen, physical health doctor. But for spiritually speaking, we have to go to the Bible. We have to say and answer honestly, am I following Jesus the way that the Bible tells me to, or have I just kind of made up my own rules? So to reverse spiritual atrophy, not only do you have to recognize that you're moving towards a problem, but you have to realize that there's hope for you. You realize that you're not beyond God's control. You're not beyond His reach. You're not beyond His saving grace and power, and that all you have to do is turn about in humble repentance, and God will rescue you. James says, submit yourselves then to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Come near to God, and He will come near to you. Wash your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Grieve, mourn, and wail. Change your laughter to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and He will lift you up. Peter gives a very similar thought. He says, humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that He may lift you up in due time. You see, whenever you recognize that you're moving towards a problem, or even if you realize you have a problem, you turn to the one who fixes it. Whether it be a doctor or a mechanic, or in bigger issues, more important issues like your spiritual health, you turn to God. You turn to Him before it's too late. You see, Solomon was a guy who had it all. He was a king who had it all, but he lost the only thing that mattered, his relationship with God. See, and truthfully, that's the only thing that matters in this life, because it's the only thing that affects the next life. Think about Solomon. He likely trained himself to be godly. But he didn't continue in that training. He didn't continue in that training, and so his spiritual health deteriorated. His heart and his ears were turned away from God and towards his wives. And he made compromises in his faith after compromises. And finally led him away from God. I want you to keep something in mind. Solomon was older when this happened. He wasn't in his youth whenever he was led astray. He was older. It's a danger that we face throughout our entire lives, and it shows the need for continually practicing to follow Jesus. You see, King Solomon's faith, and therefore his life, yielded to spiritual atrophy. And so I urge you this morning to be on your guard. And as Paul urged the Corinthians, so I urge you, examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves. Do you not realize that Christ Jesus is in you? Unless, of course, you fail the test. This morning, as we sing the song of invitation, think about your spiritual health. Where are you at in relation to where you need to be? So if you would please stand as we sing the song of invitation. Are you washed in the blood?